Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this morning for the session all about all you need to know about ChatGPT as part of our Tech Vision series here at techUK. My name is Catherine Holden. And for the next hour, we aim to move beyond the hype and discuss exactly what generative AI is, its capabilities, and also its limitations. We're going to delve into some of the biggest questions associated with the technology, such as the impact of this technology on society and how we ensure this technology is used in a way that is both ethical and responsible. I have a stellar panel lined up with me this morning. Just to sort of briefly introduce them, Darren Fleetwood, who is the head of data and analytics at Medano, B. Longworth, who heads up government affairs for EMEA at NVIDIA, Hugh Millward, who is the general manager for corporate, external and legal affairs at Microsoft, and Lewis Wood, who is the algorithm developer at Mivite. And before I allow them to just go into a bit more detail about themselves, their organizations and the work they're doing around generative AI, we just wanted to let you know we'd like to make this session as interactive as possible. So if you do have any questions for the panel, please do include those in the chat. I will be monitoring that throughout the session and trying to make sure we pose the best questions to the panel at the end of this session. So yes, a huge thank you to the panel. Maybe, Darren, if I could just go over to you first, just to briefly introduce yourself and your organisation.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm Darren. I'm head of data analytics at Medano. We're a communications consultancy. We mainly work in scientific and technological areas, so things like healthcare, net zero, that kind of thing. Obviously, we work in comms, so our world is text. So there's a lot of potential applications we've been looking at this type of technology. We've also been looking at where actually we can't use it or shouldn't be using it, and I'm sure we'll come on to that as well. I'm part of the research team, so another aspect we've been looking at is using things like GPT and similar technologies from an analytical point of view as well, which again I'm sure we'll get to in the conversation.
Thank you, Darren. B, over to you.
Thank you, Catherine. Hi, everybody. Good morning. I'm B. Longworth. I'm part of the government relations team at NVIDIA. NVIDIA is a tech company. For anybody who doesn't know us, we started out in graphics. If you are a gamer or if you have young people in your family who are gamers, perhaps you know us through that. But these days, we have a really strong focus on artificial intelligence. So NVIDIA essentially creates the hardware and software tools that data scientists and researchers and companies use to build applications which apply technologies like artificial intelligence, as well as high performance computing, quantum, and the metaverse. And really glad to have Hugh on the call with us today. NVIDIA has been quite heavily involved in ChatGPT, and the system runs on about 10,000 NVIDIA GPUs. If anybody does get really excited about speeds and feeds and technology, there's an excellent blog that Microsoft published recently, which goes into all the nitty-gritty about all that stuff, so you can geek out. And the other thing I will say, gratuitous plug very quickly, if you want to spend more time on the topic of generative AI, NVIDIA has an event next week called the GTC conference from the 20th to the 23rd of March. There's about 70 sessions on generative AI, including a conversation between NVIDIA's CEO and the chief scientist of OpenAI about exactly this topic. So encourage you to check it out. And then for the purposes of today's conversation, I think it's a really interesting opportunity to talk about whether generative AI and ChatGPT are necessarily bringing that much that's new to the conversation, or whether they're accelerating and adding hype to questions that already existed. In some ways, that's a good thing. In some ways, it's an additional challenge. But overall, democratizing this technology within a framework which manages risk is really going to be key to maximizing the economic and social benefits of the technology. And actually, the UK is really, really well positioned to maximize those benefits. So really looking forward to the conversation today.
Thank you, B. And we're already in the chat asking for a few links to your GTC conference. So if you're able to maybe add that, that would be wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, B. Hugh, maybe over to you.
Yeah, thanks for that, B. I mean, good hand over there. It's been great working with NVIDIA, I have to say. Really key to this whole AI thing. So I'm Hugh Millward. I lead corporate, external, and legal for Microsoft in the UK. Microsoft has been involved in AI for some time now. You kind of don't get to where the industry has got to on large language models and on GPT-4 now, it has been revealed, without some considerable investment, not least in the kind of chips that NVIDIA make. A lot of work going on AI, including generative AI at the moment, which you'll be aware of. We're particularly interested at the moment about, certainly from a public policy perspective, on the regulation of AI. How do we ensure that we're bringing responsibility into the core of it, but also that we are regulating in a way that doesn't stifle innovation at source effectively? So super interesting conversation I think we're going to have on those aspects as well.
Thank you, Hugh. Yeah, very much looking forward to a conversation around the governance and potential regulation of this technology. So thank you. And finally, Lewis.
Hi, I'm Lewis. So I've recently graduated from university and gone straight into the algorithm development space for MiVite. We're a company that specializes in reducing bias in the hiring process. For example, removing bias-causing information from CVs, and to do that, we use AI. Recently, we've been investigating the use of these large language models, generative large language models, in use case of parsing, which ChatGPT kind of excels at, the whole summarization task. So we're trying to see, if can we utilize this technology to parse CVs into formats more useful for hiring managers and recruiters. That's probably a good intro for me.
Yeah, thank you, Lewis. Brilliant. And maybe just kind of to kickstart the conversation, I'm happy to throw this open to anyone, because I know that it's sometimes a bit of a tricky question, but so we're all on the same page. Who would like to describe to me what generative AI is and how does it work in practice?
Sure. Yeah, I can go for that.
Thank you.
So generative AI is a kind of a subset of AI which aims to generate data from a data set it's been trained on. So for example, let's go with ChatGPT or GPT itself. It's been trained to predict the next word of a sentence or the next word of a document from a large corpus of text, in this case, an internet-sized corpus of text. And the idea is that when you ask it to generate text, it will generate text that is pretty much indistinguishable from the text it's been trained on, which is why you kind of get this readable output. Generative AI isn't just focused onto these like large language models. There is, I think you've probably seen like the DALL-E 2 models, which can generate images, and there's also audio generation, so like mimicking people's voices. So it's just a subset of AI that aims to generate the data it's been trained on.
Thank you, Lewis. And Hugh, as you've mentioned, that this technology, you've actually been working on for a really long time. Is there anything you'd like to bring in, anything in particular that Microsoft's doing in this space around generative AI and the latest iteration that was announced yesterday that you'd like to sort of discuss with the group?
Yeah, I mean, building on Lewis's point there, which is, that this is a subset of AI, I think is an important point. We've been developing AI for a long time. You've got AI that is developed for specific tasks, for example. So you could have facial recognition, for example, that doesn't use a generative AI approach. And so generative AI is as Lewis says, a subset. I think where it's really exciting is where you can use a trained model trained on billions of nodes, and then train it. So you've got a model that's already trained, and then you train it again on a small subset of very specific information. And then you think about what you could do with that, how you could interrogate it. If you think about perhaps in the healthcare space or in research, having a trained model then focus on a collection of very specific resources in healthcare or peer-reviewed articles or whatever, and actually develop that specificity is really very exciting. And so right across the economy, you can see so many different applications of this, being able to use a trained model in this way. I think what we're doing, and the direction of travel we're going at the moment is to, yes, it's in Bing as a way of improving search, and our friends at Google are watching carefully as well, as we look to try to improve the way in which Bing search operates by the integration of this kind of model. But it's also, I think, quite exciting to see the developments of integration into the rest of the Microsoft Office suite. So, if you think about the way in which you might be able to use generative AI in Visual Studio or in ways in which you might code, so you use a language approach to coding. There was an interesting piece in the press I saw the other day that someone had developed a new kind of Sudoku game using maths, but just generating it entirely through text. So, write me a program that does this, and actually, because it's discursive, it's language oriented, it can do that. But equally, the kind of application in Word, for example, or in PowerPoint, what you might be able to do by saying, create me a really nice slide that does this and does that, and in the style of that, or if you're writing a letter or a report, and effectively it does a lot of the work for you. I think what's really interesting is so much of this, and I think when we're looking at, we're probably going to get onto recruitment, because we've got people here with specialisms in it, is how much it continues to be important to have a human in the loop on this. And so the expectation that that a large language model will provide you with the definitive answer, and that you can just sort of generate and send. I think we've got to kind of get away a little bit from that, and we've got to make sure that we are retaining the human in the loop, so that there is this element of responsibility and there is this element of accountability for the content, so that it gives you a good first pass at something, but it does need you as a user or an operator to be involved as well.
And I would add to that I think one of the reasons why ChatGPT has struck such a chord and why generative AI is so exciting and provocative is because it challenges our assumptions that creativity is inherently human, and that this is something computers aren't good at. And generative AI is particularly good at things that traditional computers were quite bad at, and particularly understanding the context and relationship between data. I came across an explanation of one of the reasons why ChatGPT is so amazing, which used a couple of example phrases, which for a human are very easy to understand. I poured the water from a jug into a cup until it was empty. We know that it in that case refers to the jug. We infer that from the context of language. I poured the water from the jug into the cup until it was full. Suddenly it refers to the cup. We just know that. For a computer, that's an incredibly complex problem to solve. But with ChatGPT, we've got there. But it's important to remember this technology is not just doing our homework for us. It has the potential to bring technology to industries that haven't previously been well served by tech, by democratizing technology effectively. And as Hugh said, making it so much easier to interact with computers, and for our spoken language, essentially to become a computer programming language. And the incredible rate of adoption of ChatGPT really demonstrates how compelling this is for people who are not technologists by training, and I would absolutely put myself in that category. It's hit hundreds of millions of users faster than any other piece of technology in history. And it's also exciting to see that a lot of that innovation, in addition to ChatGPT, is being driven by open source developers and startups. And for the UK particularly, which has such a rich open source developer and startup community, I think that's just an incredible opportunity.
Absolutely, completely agree. And just to kind of go into that conversation into where we're seeing kind of potential kind of applications and the capabilities of this technology. I know, Darren, you're working with a couple of kind of customers looking at how this technology could be used by those particular organizations. Is there anything you could tell us in a bit more detail on that?
Yeah, sure. So I think really just building on Hugh's point, that having the human in the loop, I think is the really key bit. And we've seen applications. So, for example, we do a lot of literature reviews where a researcher needs to read hundreds of papers and extract kind of relevant parts of that. We've seen it work really well where we're not replacing the researcher. The research still needs to be very much in that process, but we're using the model on the extraction bit, the kind of the legwork type bit, to do that part, and then free the researcher up to do the thinking bit and the strategizing and the planning and understanding the results. And I think that's that's where we've seen, I think, really nice applications. I think there was a MIT study that came out a few weeks ago that summed this up really nicely, where they gave a bunch of professionals writing tasks, and they assessed the kind of the speed and the quality of the output. And half the people had access to GPT and half of them didn't. And the ones with GPT, it increased productivity and quality. But what it also did was kind of change the task. So without GPT, people were spending a lot of time, rough drafting, going through that really manual process. With GPT, the model was doing the drafting for them, and they spent a lot more time on ideation and brainstorming and all of these kinds of things. And I think that's where it's really exciting, is almost unlocking that human intelligence, if you like, rather than trying to replace it.
And Darren, just to follow up on that, are you seeing there's particular sort of sectors or industries that are kind of really excelling with the use of this technology and the kind of the forerunners in this space? Is there any particular industries that are thriving?
Yeah, so I mean, academia and science is a really obvious place for me. A lot of the tasks there, the quantity of kind of scientific output is kind of increasing exponentially, and just even quite small fields, one researcher can't keep up with everything that's kind of published. And so using some of these tools, and there've been some really interesting things available for kind of a few years, but are now starting to integrate things like large language models. Using some of these tools to kind of manage that quantity, I think is really interesting.
Thank you, Darren. Lewis, your thoughts from your perspective, when it comes to HR and hiring and recruitment, on kind of the opportunities, the capabilities of the technology, but also some of the limitations as well.
Yeah, so the capabilities of generative AI are quite obvious. So you can, for example, generate job descriptions, generate CVs, or in our case, use them for redaction or parsing of information to kind of streamline the hiring process. However, one of the big limitations of these models is obviously the bias inherent in them. So when trained, for example, ChatGPT or GPT was trained on the internet effectively, which contains lots of inherent bias. And the bias reflected in the data is going to be reflected in the outputs. So this is something to keep in mind when trying to use these tools. And for example, there's a study published in Nature recently that found, I believe, GPT associated Islam and violence, which would lead to severely negative outputs. And there's methods of debiasing some of the large language models, for example, curating your data sets. But at the moment, I think the current methodology, from what I've seen, is kind of guardrailing and training GPT or ChatGPT to refuse these sensitive prompts. For example, GPT-4, the paper released, I believe, yesterday or the day before, has managed to cut the response rate for these sensitive prompts by around 80%. But even then, out of 1,000 negative prompts, you're still going to get 10 or 20 negative responses that it's responded to. So I think the main way I see it affecting society and jobs in general at the moment is upskilling. So it's not going to be replacing people. It still needs to be, you need to keep in mind it's a tool. And for personal experience, I've recently had to do some JavaScript development, which I'm not too familiar with, but the ability, the efficiency and the speed at which I've managed to upskill myself to develop this JavaScript website was dramatically increased with ChatGPT, because I could ask it questions, it could give me feedback, I could ask it what it's doing. And compared to something like Stack Overflow, where you're just going to get a one-line response or something just beyond you, that's how I see these kind of technologies really affecting the workplace.
I think coding is quite a nice example, because it feels like a bit of a forerunner for this, in that for a couple of years or so, or a few years, there've been models that produce kind of passably good code. I think one of my colleagues put it quite nicely that the models aren't going to replace programmers, but programmers with the models will probably replace programmers without them. And I think we've just seen that these tools are so useful, especially in areas where you're less certain, or you don't. I'm the same, Lewis. I don't know JavaScript. I had to write some the other day, and this model was the models were very, very useful to kind of be able to speed that up.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone who's starting to drop some questions in the chat. We will try and get to as many of those as possible. I guess I'd just like to, now we've obviously spoken about some of the capabilities, the limitations, and obviously what generative AI is. Obviously, it feels like we're very much, at a very nascent stage, in terms of where the technology is at the moment and where it's going to go in the future. So I was just wondering, and again, happy to throw this open to a question for anyone in the panel to answer. What impact can you see this technology having on businesses and society, sort of, I guess, in the short term, but also in the long term as well? Who would like to answer that?
I'm happy to give that a go.
Thank you.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? So yes, it's nascent, but we've also just moved forward massively, dramatically, in a very short period of time. And so actually, I think we'll probably continue to see these sort of lurches forward, these sudden moves, and that's actually quite exciting. What will it do? I mean, I think part of it is the constraint of the imagination of the user. You can apply this in so many ways, and I was talking to the Science and Technology Select Committee, whatever, a couple of weeks ago, and they were asking about where this might be. I mean, a good example is we're using AI in parts of India to identify hotspots of where there are heat waves, and hotspots where you've got tin roofs on houses, and you can predict in advance precisely where these might be, so you can put Hessian sacks on top of the roofs in order to reduce the impact of the temperature rise, but you can do it in a way that's predictive. And it's to take something that looks like quite fun on a search engine or on the GPT site that you can get it to write poems and things like that, but apply it to a real world situation where it's actually going to save lives. I think it's really quite exciting and quite transformational. So it may not be version 4, it may be around the corner that we're able to do these things, but the ability to be able to, I mean, in some respects, AI is, we can think about it as faster and more capable computing. And if you think about it like that, then how might you apply faster and more capable computing to some of society's biggest challenges in the world? I mean, where do we face real issues? How can we move faster, at a faster pace on some of the biggest challenge we face, whether that's the search for sources of clean energy, or whether it's reversing climate change, or there's a whole area so I think really it is constrained by the imagination, but also, again, this point about making sure that we get the regulation of this right, so that we don't start restricting use cases that we can't necessarily predict at the moment, but that we focus on the use cases that we know about now.
I think probably one thing we can be certain of is it's going to be hard to predict. 10 years ago, we were all talking about AI replacing manual jobs, and actually manual dexterity turned out to be a much harder problem to solve than we'd anticipated. And actually, text and vision turned out to be a lot easier. And I think what we might see is a kind of a switch in kind of entry-level jobs. So, the kind of the list of jobs that are likely to be affected is almost kind of reversed, and now we might see some of the kind of the entry-level roles changing, particularly in these kind of white-collar professions. I wonder in a way if actually the switch to kind of white-collar professions might be a kind of a positive thing, in that I think there's a lot more scope for these types of technologies to be complementary in those sorts of jobs rather than kind of replacing them. So in a way, for society, the fact that this has turned out to be easier might turn out to be a good thing.
Thank you, Darren.
I think it's also important to think about this in terms of, ChatGPT really is one of those 10-year overnight successes. It's been a long time in the making. the technology itself, as anybody who's used it will be able to tell, is pretty exciting and pretty sophisticated. It's the application of that technology now that we need to understand more about. And a lot of those risks we already understand and regulators are already thinking about. Again, it's just that the phenomenon that is ChatGPT has accelerated the attention it's getting and added hype. So I guess my message to people around this tends to be confusingly sort of be excited, this is exciting, but also calm down. This is it's okay, people are already thinking about this. And topics like fairness, bias, explainability, transparency are very much already on the agenda. Not to say that they're solved, they're huge challenges that need to be managed in a very nuanced way. But I would argue that there are relatively few new challenges that ChatGPT is introducing. It does increase the scale of some of those challenges, and things like content moderation, when you have the ability to create vast amounts of content and dump that into a system, are really going to stretch the capabilities of existing regulations. So for me, there's a big question and a piece of work to be done to understand what structures, standards, regulations do we already have that are perfectly capable of regulating this technology, and where are there real gaps? Exactly as Hugh said in his introduction, where should we be kind of focusing attention in order to ensure that work and that effort is going in the right direction?
Yeah, thank you. And B, maybe just to stick with you for a moment on that, I think a consistent theme that's coming through on the chat from some of the questions is an underlying concern from some of the attendees around, well, what if this technology, which is obviously incredibly powerful, gets into the hands of bad actors or is used in a very unethical way, you know? And there's obviously, like with any technology, some concerns with how this technology could be used and how it could be applied. So from your perspective, and I know you've sort of touched on this slightly already, would you say here in the UK, we have the right sort of regulatory structures in place to ensure this technology is used ethically and responsibly, or do you think more needs to be done?
I think there is a responsibility at every stage of the chain, if you like. So certainly there is a responsibility of the organisations, and in many cases the individuals who are creating this technology, to do everything that they can to make sure that the result is ethical and accurate applications in whatever field they're being designed for. There's a responsibility from regulators to do everything they can to put frameworks in place that enable innovation but also manage risk. But there's also a degree of responsibility on the part of users as well, and regulators have a fun job in deciding where the emphasis should lie between those 3 points. Of course, there will always be, unfortunately, malicious actors, and therefore, you know, there is that emphasis on the other two parts of the chain, if you like, the regulator and the technology developers and providers, to do everything that they can in order to manage that. I do see that in some ways as an opportunity. I think you will see a flowering of applications, as Darren mentioned, which are kind of an evolution of tools that already exist, for example, in the academic world for detecting plagiarism. I think you're going to see a flowering of tools which probably will themselves use AI in order to detect whether large language models have been used, for example, and to try and filter out any effects of those bad actors. But it's certainly going to be a pretty challenging balancing act.
Thank you, B. Hugh, would you like to come in on that point as well?
So I absolutely agree with B on this, and I think that's one of the reasons why getting the balance right between where at what point you regulate is important. And you know, I think the approach taken by the European Commission is potentially, you know, going in slightly the wrong direction in the fact that it's restricting the use of AI in whole sectors or whole segments of use. And actually, I think we need to move more to a model that is both requiring a level of responsibility at the kind of the model end, at the developer end, at the, you know, the kind of if it was Microsoft, then we would shoulder responsibility for making sure that we're producing a product that works and does what it says and is accountable and transparent and the other things that we talked about. But at the same time, there is a requirement to regulate at the use case end. And I think really we should be thinking about specific use cases. And again, you know, large language models is no different from other aspects of AI, but we should be thinking carefully about not regulating the model or not restricting the model, but the use case of the model. And to give you an example of that, you know, you want to be able to use image recognition for scanning large numbers of radiograms to identify cancers, for example. That feels like an entirely appropriate use of image recognition. You can also use image recognition for identifying missing children in crowds. You can also use it for scanning crowds for known criminals. You can also use it for target acquisition in military drones. And you know, you may well be looking at the same technology in all of those. And what you don't want to get to is a point where you're restricting the technology itself, or you know, that you're instead focused on the use case of the technology. And that then will encourage innovation at the developer end, while making sure that we're protecting, you know, the way in which it's used. And so actually having, you know, big swathes of restrictions, like, for example, not using AI in critical national infrastructure, makes no sense, where AI is perfectly placed to be able to identify anomalies in data, for example. And if you're running a nuclear installation, you absolutely want to be able to identify anomalies in data. And yet, if it's a part of critical national infrastructure and you've restricted the use of AI in it, you're actually holding back your own ability to do things better. So we've got to get this balance right between the regulation of the model itself and the regulation of the use case.
Thank you, Hugh. Darren, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I wonder if one of the things that we need reasonably urgently alongside legislation is education for, you know, for the and fairly clear guidance for those of us who are, you know, using these models in our work, but also consumers as well, around kind of appropriate use. And I think all of us have a kind of a role and responsibility in educating our kind of users and our customers and so on about where or where not this should be kind of used and the kind of correct use. But also I think some guidance for us as developers as to where or where and how to best manage the risks involved.
Thank you, Darren. You mentioned there obviously the importance of kind of like public education, and obviously public awareness we know is really important for building trust in this area. Do the panel have any thoughts on sort of the concept of sort of watermarking in this space to try and identify where maybe sort of generative AI has been used and particular sources of information have been generated or changed and adapted as a result of this technology, and therefore making the public aware of that through a watermark or other sort of similar kind of concepts? What do people think in terms of that as a solution, and how effective that could be?
It's interesting. So if I write you an email, but I've got the, you know, ChatGPT doing the first draft of it, is it valuable to you at all that it's watermarked that AI has been involved in it? And so again, I think it's probably use case based. So there are some particular circumstances where that is valuable. And you know, I come back to the point about having humans in the loop. You know, really, the what people are worried about is AI making decisions, and they're making decisions in a way that they wouldn't agree with, or feels like in an inappropriate use of a decision. We should bear in mind that humans are far more biased than most AI, you know, and so yeah, actually, it's about what people are comfortable with rather than what the actual data points to. And so if there are use cases where it feels important to flag that AI has been involved, absolutely, 100%. But actually having a requirement that any involvement of AI, I mean, we use predictive text on our phones at the moment, and that's AI. You know, it's so do we want to have at the end of every message, if your spelling is being corrected, that there's a watermark? No, we don't. So I think again it comes down to use cases.
Thank you, Hugh.
Yeah, I think
Anyone
it's
else?
really important. So humans make decisions all the time, and we have some sort of inherent trust in humans. And I think fundamentally it's because it's explainable, like humans can back up their decisions, give kind of points on why they've made that decisions. But these AI, like effectively black boxes, you can't see what's led to the decision that's been made. And I think that kind of degrades the trust in them quite severely. So we definitely need a push for explainable AI. And I think AI education in general will help, because I think if people understand how these tools are being created and how they're like working, that will also increase their trust in these technologies.
That's a great point. Public trust is incredibly important. And from that point of view, I always find it really interesting to know that in a lot of cases, AI tools are being used to try and develop solutions which address these kinds of challenges, like explainability, and also AI tools for detecting images, for example, that have been altered or generated using AI. So, as you said, Lewis, that education piece to help people understand AI is not only doing sinister things, it's also part of the ways of approaching and helping to solve some of these challenges. I think can be quite a powerful story.
Darren, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it would be interesting to see how kind of norms change around this, particularly around authenticity, and where, you know, the model being involved in the process makes the output inauthentic in some kind of way or not. I read a case study of a mental health charity that was using a model like this to do first drafts on a kind of a text response that the support workers would change. Obviously, they needed to publicize this, and it went down really badly because the output felt inauthentic to the people who are kind of using this. And obviously, the charity was just trying to reach more people, but that turned out to be just a use case where, if the text was exactly the same, just the fact that the model was involved some way in that process made it kind of inauthentic. So it'd be interesting to see where those kinds of areas apply and how those kind of expectations or norms shift, I guess.
Thank you, Darren. I'd just like to now move on to, just because it's incredibly timely, what with the budget yesterday, there was a number of announcements related to AI that I thought were particularly of interest for this webinar today. For those of you that haven't necessarily been sort of wading into the detail of the announcement, there was a couple of things. There was the announcement of this multi-regulator AI sandbox, which is looking at how they enable industry to test cutting-edge technology such as generative AI in a safe and secure regulatory environment. There was the publication of the Patrick Vallance review as well, which included a sort of a couple of commitments there around government creating a code of practice by the end of summer on text and data mining in relation to generative AI. And interestingly, there was also a commitment by government to establish a task force, I think it was called the Foundation Models Task Force, to advance UK sovereign capability in foundation models, including large language models. And essentially, this task force will then be providing direct advice to ministers on how we ensure the UK is at the forefront of this technology. That's just a glimpse into some of many recommendations that have been made, or commitments that have been made by government related to tech. Just keen to get, you know, the panel any initial thoughts or reflections on some of the announcements that were made yesterday. Anyone want to go for that?
I think from my point of view, it's overall positive. And generally speaking, the tone that the government's been striking recently, there was an absolute flurry of announcements at the beginning of March relative to this space. That sort of positive tone is very encouraging, and that sort of pro-innovation tone is very welcome. And Hugh already mentioned that it's quite challenging to consider that this technology could be in effect stifled by regulation. I mentioned earlier the important role that developers and startups are playing in, particularly with generative AI, kind of as the engine of innovation. There's a real risk that if the compliance burden is too high, it's too complex, it's too expensive, it's too risky, you freeze out those smaller actors who just can't afford to implement the technology. And you end up with a situation where only the largest actors effectively can afford to implement the technology. And I think that's counterproductive to what most governments are looking for. So the more kind of open mindset that UK government seems to be displaying in that respect is welcome. Obviously, we need more than warm words, and that's not to diminish in any way the challenge of, again, striking that balance that we've talked about between the opportunities and the risks. I think, as you mentioned, the Valence report, the sandboxing concept is really interesting. And I would like to see in the AI white paper a bit more meat on the bones about exactly what that's gonna look like. The concept of sandboxes is quite central to various different regulatory concepts worldwide, but it's proving to be a little thorny in terms of exactly what it means and how it works. So again, it's an opportunity for the UK to be a leader there if they can come out with a good solution.
Absolutely, and it's great to see that there's obviously a multi-regulatory sandbox, so bringing together different regulators, but how do we make sure that they have if it's going to be the DRCF that's kind of leading on the coordination, do they have the capacity and the resourcing there to carry out that role effectively? Absolutely. Hugh, sorry.
Well, Catherine, what I was going to say was that I think a lot of the announcements are great. I completely agree with B. I do think that it's worth government thinking carefully, though, about where it makes its interventions, where it actually invests its efforts and its money. And I've just got a slide to share, if you don't mind, just for a second.
Yes, please do.
Because I think this is it's a way of looking at the opportunity in just a second. Here we go. It's a way of looking at the opportunity, and it's what we're calling the AI stack. Now, I think there are a number of ways in which we actually, might look at the way in which this sort of ladders up. But this is there are lots of other models out there. But the idea here is that you've got, at the bottom there, you've got the infrastructure, and you're talking about some of the work that B's company NVIDIA does, and some of the data center, and this is the real infrastructure level, and you may or may not want to replicate that. It's billions of dollars of investment, and it feels like maybe that's not the point at which you want government intervention. And then you've got the kind of the acceleration software at the next level. Think about that, in some respects, and I think Lewis will hate me for this, but broadly, it's the kind of operating system for the infrastructure there. That's one way of looking at it. Okay, so is there value in replicating that? Not sure. Pre-trained AI models, there may or may not be value in, and there's some discussion at the moment about sovereign AI, large language models, and you kind of think, well, okay, fine, you could invest in a sovereign large language model, but what do you really get from that? And is it valuable? And in fact, can you take a pre-trained AI model and then train it again on narrower data sets that are more localized as an alternative to developing a sovereign large language model? Don't know. I think, but again, it's expensive to do this. And then you look at the API services that might sit on top of a model. Absolutely. I mean, tremendous opportunity here in developing multiple AI APIs that interrogate a large language model in different ways. Great opportunity there for investment and for UK. And then you've got the applications that use the APIs. And this is really where the opportunity lies for UK businesses to generate new use cases for this and export them across the world. And so actually where we would think is, at what point does it make sense to put public money, public sector intervention in order to be able to extract maximum value for UK PLC? And so actually one of the conversations we're kind of having with government is to say, how are you thinking about the way in which this layers up, and how are you thinking about where you want to put your investment, where you want to see the economic growth and the value for the economy?
Thank you. I really like that visual as well, seeing exactly how that stacks up. I guess, though, just sort of maybe asking that question back to you, what specifically, I guess, would you like to be seeing, particularly with the imminent publication of the long-awaited UK AI white paper? Where would you like to see government committing when it comes to generative AI?
Well, I think, if I'm honest, you could spend, you could duplicate, you could do some of the stuff on the large language model. You could have a sovereign large language model. I think, as B has put in, there are some interesting ways in which you can extract value. And we should think about that. It's expensive. I mean, it really is. I mean, not just in electricity costs, in everything, you know, about it is really expensive. But I think it's the top two levels. It's developing APIs, and it's also and actual products and services that use those. That's where the investment should go, and that's where we need to use things like tax incentives and other kind of levers of government to actually really open that opportunity up.
Interesting. Thank you, Hugh. Darren, any thoughts on that? Where would you like to be seeing government sort of, you know, focusing its efforts?
Yeah, I agree. I think, you know, for those of us I think we want kind of guardrails and you know, be able to have a kind of an area to be able to kind of explore in. So I think certainly at that kind of top level, in terms of use cases, I think having that kind of education alongside, you know, as a complement to regulation, I think is really important, and may well be easier, you know, at least as a kind of interim step, to be able to help kind of equip us to use these things responsibly.
Thank you, Darren. B, any thoughts, particularly with the upcoming UK AI white paper around the corner? What would you like to see?
I think it's very much about kind of putting meat on the bones. As I said, there have been a lot of good noises made, and it's very encouraging. Now it's time almost for the real hard work to begin, and to get into how we're going to make all those things real. And so I think forums like this, and other opportunities for this kind of broad mix of different players who are involved at every stage of the ecosystem, contributing their ideas, contributing their experience, is going to be very important to make sure that we get that mix right. And you know, there are, as Hugh mentioned, there's some appetite for this idea of sovereign models, but it is really about focusing that resource in the right place, not only money and budget, but also attention and human energy, because ultimately it's going to be human energy that will get this over the line. You know, they are very complex challenges to solve, but I hope that this panel has done a good enough job in convincing the audience here that the opportunities are worth the work. It's worth putting in the hard yards to get this right from a regulatory framework point of view.
Thank you, B. Really appreciate that. We are very quickly coming to near the end of the webinar, which has gone really quickly, but I'll try and see if there's some questions I can tease out from the chat. But whilst I'm doing that, Lewis, maybe I could come to you. You know, we've had a very interesting discussion, just touched on lots and lots of different things in the last hour or so. Obviously, what a lot of this does come back to, though, none of this will be possible if we aren't able to kind of build that public trust and understanding in this kind of technology. So I guess from your perspective, what would you say is the most important thing that we must focus on right now to ensure that we do build that public trust and confidence in the use of generative AI?
Yeah, I think fundamentally we need people to understand AI. So a lot of people at the moment, it's recently blown up, and there are a lot more people interested in AI, but I don't think there's enough AI education. And I think as we educate more people in AI, the understanding and the trust will come alongside that. I think also, as I said earlier, the explainability of AI is very important, and making sure that we can have strong benchmarks and strong kind of standards of testing to prove that, or that these models don't hold these kind of strong biases towards certain groups, and strong kind of frameworks of testing these models before they're put into production. But I think, yeah, my top thing I would say would be education of AI.
Thank you, Lewis. Darren, what are your thoughts?
I think it's important as well, and this feels like it taps very much into the theme that we've been discussing, that we don't overreach. I think it's certainly at this stage, and I think that all of us have, you know, take the responsibility to think through the kind of the use cases that we're applying this to, and that they're kind of safe and appropriate at the moment. You know, while regulatory frameworks and all of those kinds of things are being developed around this. You know, my Twitter feed looks a little bit like the Wild West, in these things being thrown into a lot of things at the moment. I think we just need a little more caution, a little more hesitancy from everybody involved, I think, in making sure this is applied safely.
Thank you, Darren. B, how about you?
Yeah, I just want to return to a point that I made about the contribution that AI systems can actually make to creating that, if you like, AI audit that Lewis mentioned. And again, this is going to be a tough nut to crack, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that it's also an opportunity to create a new market. The UK is already incredibly strong in audit services. This is something else that UK PLC can look to add to its portfolio and provide out to the world. It's exactly those kinds of tools to be able to benchmark explainability, fairness, and the financial services industry is actually doing some very interesting work on explainability because they own some of those high risk use cases that are going to be in the front line when it comes to being able to prove those sort of core standards and audit those standards. Another technique that I find really interesting is synthetic data, and in fact there's a team led by a fantastic researcher called Anima Anand-Kumar, who's part of NVIDIA, who've been doing work using generative AI to create synthetic data, which they're then using to train models in order to mitigate bias and ensure that that training data set that they're using not only causes no concerns in terms of privacy of the data who it might belong to because it's synthetic data, but they can also control very exactly the diversity of that data. And so I think that's a really exciting approach as well that can help us create this virtuous cycle where the AI systems are actually contributing to keeping other systems honest. So absolutely, we mentioned earlier, there are bad actors, there are potential negative use cases for this, but there are also those white knights out there as well who are very much focused on using this technology to sort of solve its own problems.
Thank you, B. Wonderful. And maybe finally, Hugh, I'd just like to come to you on that same question around sort of building public trust, understanding and confidence, but also maybe sort of in addition to that, so the second half of the question is, I know obviously you also recently gave evidence to the House of Commons Science and Technology Select Committee, and a big part of this is not just about how do we build public understanding, but also parliamentary understanding as well, particularly if we're going to get things such as, potential regulation or legislation in this area right. So any thoughts on that? How do we build that parliamentary understanding to make sure that the governance and regulation that is put in place is effective and pro-innovation whilst also addressing some of the risks or challenges associated with the technology?
Goodness knows. I mean, we've tried. I mean, I chair the CBI Tech Council, and we were discussing this literally, Monday or Tuesday of this week. It's really hard. So the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology does a really good job of, kind of unpacking developments in technology for politicians. But it's really hard, and it's really hard to get the balance right between, the focus on extremes of both ends, and actually, the sort of dystopian view of what technology will do for society, and also, kind of an overemphasis on it's all sort of unicorns and rainbows, and I think actually what we're really talking about is something that is a bit more mundane in the middle. It's not mundane, it is in fact very exciting, but it is a bit more in the middle there. How do we help people to understand, politicians, regulators in particular, what it is that we're doing? Super hard, and so I think that I mean, it would take the efforts of all of the people on this call and others to help to gently explain, I think would be invaluable. We're going to certainly be sort of playing our part on that. But also that will, if we get this right, it'll also get the regulation of it right. And, I do think that we're in a pretty good place at the moment in the UK. You've got existing legislation governs the way in which AI works to a large part. I mean, the Human Rights Act governs the way in which we think about bias. The Online Safety Bill will govern the way in which the responsibility of AI as a platform will operate. And so you've got a number of different ways in which this is managed already. And I think making sure that we are careful about the way in which we step forward into further regulation of AI so that we continue to allow the innovation is just really important. So I think it's with patience and care in explaining and continue to get the message out, I think is going to help.
Absolutely. It's a bit of a long game, but it's absolutely worth us putting in the efforts now for sure. So I think that's a really probably good note to end on. So I just wanted to say a huge thank you to my panelists, to Lewis, to Darren, to Hugh, and to Bea for a fascinating discussion. I think, as you've seen from the amount, well, first of all, the amount of people who've joined this session, but also the number of questions we've got in the chat, this is probably the first of a number of sessions we'll be doing on this particular topic, generative AI at techUK. So if you would like to get involved in future sessions, future webinars, then please get in touch with myself. Just a shameless plug at the end for a couple of other sort of upcoming activities that are happening at techUK. So this is as part of our Future Vision series here at techUK. So my colleague Laura Foster will be holding our next session, which I'm sure she'll be adding a link to the chat in a moment. We're also running our annual AI campaign week during April, the 17th to the 21st of April. And each day we focus on a different theme or topic. The Wednesday theme is generative AI. So again, if within your own organizations you have use cases, blogs, thought leadership pieces, or would like to get involved in events, then again, please reach out to myself. We will include a link in the chat to that. And at the bottom of that page, there should also be an opportunity to sign up to our newsletter, our monthly tech and innovation newsletter, where you'll find out a lot more information about what's going on within our programme. There are events going on almost every day of the week at techUK, so lots and lots to get involved in. But other than that, I'd love to say, have a brilliant rest of day, and thank you all to the panel and all the audience for your time this morning. Thank you, everybody.